Late one autumn night in 2016, in a forgotten corner of Pennsylvania, three friends, Evan Turner, Kyle Mercer, and Lucy Grant, found themselves driving through the narrow back roads that cut across fields and thick clusters of oak and pine, the kind of roads where the asphalt crumbles at the edges and telephone wires sag overhead like tired lines on an old map. And as their car's headlights swept across the darkness, they spotted a familiar shape in the distance, the hulking outline of Whitmore Textile Mill, abandoned since the late 70s, its broken windows and rusted roof looming like a relic from another life. And the idea came impulsively from Kyle, who always pushed them toward things they would never do on their own, suggesting they stop and take some pictures, something to post later, something that looked daring but harmless. And Lucy, who was usually careful, gave a hesitant laugh, glancing at Evan, who sat behind the wheel chewing at his lip, and after a brief exchange of shrugs they pulled onto the gravel shoulder and cut the engine, letting the sudden quiet of the night press in on them, the kind of quiet where even the rustle of leaves sounded louder than it should. And they stepped out under a sky streaked with thin clouds and a pale quarter moon, their breaths visible in the cold, the distant smell of damp earth and decaying wood mixing with the faint tang of metal from the car. The mill loomed closer as they crossed the field, its bricks mottled with moss and graffiti, a blackened doorway yawning open like the mouth of a cave, and Kyle lifted his phone to capture a shot of the silhouette against the moonlight, saying something about urban exploration and legends of old factories, while Lucy brushed her hair back nervously and hugged her coat tighter around her shoulders, asking if they were sure it was safe, and Evan, trying to sound braver than he felt, said it would. Just be quick. A few photos and they'd leave. Nothing more. And they laughed to steady their nerves as they edged closer to the front steps that sagged under their weight. Inside, the air was colder, carrying a musty tang like old paper and mildew, the beams above groaning softly in the night wind, their footsteps crunching over debris, shattered tiles, and decades of dust, and their flashlights cut through the dark in pale cones, sweeping over rusted machinery, overturned chairs, a workbench littered with bolts, and an old coffee mug, all untouched for decades, yet somehow arranged as if the workers might return any minute. And Lucy muttered how eerie it felt, her voice echoing off the cracked concrete walls, and Kyle responded with a joke that didn't land, his grin faltering as their lights caught an old wall of framed notices, the glass cracked and dirty, but the typed letters still faintly visible. Dates from the 60s and 70s, union meetings and production quotas, a world locked away in yellowed paper. They found themselves in a large open room where the roof had partially collapsed, moonlight streaming in through gaps and highlighting the dust that hung in the air, and Kyle suggested taking a group photo near the far wall where an old window frame remained intact, the glass smeared and broken in places, but still catching enough light to make for a dramatic shot. And they lined up, laughing awkwardly, Lucy in the middle, Kyle throwing up a mock salute, Evan holding the phone and stretching, his arm out for a wide angle, the click of the shutter loud in the stillness, and for a moment it was just them, three friends doing something reckless and silly, until Evan glanced at the photo and froze, his smile fading as he squinted at the screen, saying nothing at first, just staring, and Kyle leaned in, then Lucy, and the air seemed to grow heavier as they saw it too. A faint outline in the upper corner of the window, behind the grimy glass, something shaped like a person, tall and indistinct, as if watching them from the shadows, and Lucy let out a startled breath, whispering that there had been no one there. She was sure, and Evan zoomed in, his fingers trembling slightly, the pixels blurring but still suggesting a head, shoulders, a torso, standing motionless in a place that should have been empty. They all turned toward the window in unison, flashlights cutting across the dark, but nothing stood there now. Only the broken glass and the creeping vines outside, and Kyle let out a shaky laugh, saying maybe it was a trick of the light or a reflection, but his voice lacked conviction, and Evan bit his lip, his mind racing, until finally he said softly that he wanted to check, that they should look behind the wall. Maybe there was a platform or another room, and Lucy protested, shaking her head, saying they should just leave. But Kyle had already moved toward the far side of the room, ducking under a leaning beam and disappearing around a corner, his flashlight bobbing as he called back that he found a narrow passage, and against her better judgment Lucy followed, Evan close behind, their footsteps hesitant now, each sound magnified, every shadow thick and restless. They entered a side corridor lined with cracked tiles and flaking paint, the smell of dampness stronger here, mingled with something else, an old sour odor like wet fabric left too long in a corner. And the corridor opened into a smaller room that might have once been an office, paper scattered on the floor, a filing cabinet rusted half open, and a desk pushed against the wall where a ledger still sat, swollen with moisture but pages visible beneath the mold. And Lucy ran her fingers over the cover, recoiling as flakes of paper clung to her skin. And then Kyle's light caught something behind the desk, a narrow door with peeling green paint, half hidden by a toppled shelf. And he grinned nervously, saying maybe that's where the figure had been. Maybe there was a crawl space or a stairwell, and he shoved the shelf aside with a screech of metal on concrete, exposing the door fully. Evan reached for the handle, testing it, and the door creaked open with a sound like a long sigh, revealing a narrow staircase descending into darkness, the air rushing up from below colder still, and Lucy murmured that this was a bad idea, her voice shaking. But Kyle was already stepping onto the first stair, his flashlight beam cutting into the gloom, revealing only more steps, wet and uneven, and the faint glint of something metallic below. They stood there for a long moment listening, the silence pressing in until it seemed to have weight, and then a faint sound drifted up, a soft thud, like something shifting or falling far below, and Lucy gasped, backing away. But Evan swallowed hard, lifting his light and following Kyle down, one hand on the crumbling wall, each step coated with moisture and grit, the air smelling of rust and old wood, and Lucy, after a heartbeat of hesitation, followed them, her breath quick, her eyes darting nervously to every shadow, until they reached a landing where the stairs turned and continued deeper, and on the landing lay an old book, its cover dark with age, as if someone had left it there recently despite the decades of abandonment, and Evan crouched, brushing off the grime, feeling the rough texture of the leather, and opened it carefully, revealing handwritten pages cramped with words, the ink faded but still legible, and on the first page in looping script was a date, October 12, 1981, and a single sentence, "They move when you're not looking." Evan's heart thudded in his chest, his breath shallow as he turned to show Lucy and Kyle. Evan's fingers trembled as he closed the brittle book and slipped it into his jacket, the leather cold against his chest, while Lucy stood frozen at the landing, her flashlight beam shaking across the wet concrete steps, catching old stains and rusted bolts embedded in the wall, and Kyle, trying to mask his unease with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes, muttered that they'd already come this far and it would be a waste to turn back now, his voice echoing down into the darkness with a strange, metallic edge. And for a moment no one moved until Evan finally took a step down, feeling the slick stone beneath his shoes, his heart pounding so loudly in his ears it drowned out the distant scrape that still seemed to reverberate from below, Lucy whispering that this was insane, that the photo was reason enough to leave. But she followed anyway, hugging her arms to herself as though that might keep the chill from sinking deeper into her bones, the three of them moving cautiously there, lights carving narrow tunnels through the black, illuminating more stairs, more cobwebs, more time-worn pipes running along the wall like veins in some long-dead creature, until the staircase ended in a narrow hall with low ceilings, the air heavier and tinged with the sharp bite of mold and something metallic, perhaps old blood, though none of them said the word aloud. And as they stepped forward, their beams revealed an array of rooms branching off like ribs from a spine, each filled with forgotten relics. One had shelves collapsed beneath the weight of old manuals and crumbling blueprints. Another held a workbench with tools still laid out, as if waiting for hands that would never return. And in the largest chamber a circle of wooden chairs sat haphazardly around a table that had been overturned, its legs jutting into the air like broken bones. And Lucy murmured that someone must have used this place long after the mill closed, her voice barely audible as she stepped over the debris, when suddenly from somewhere behind them came a distinct sound, the sharp clatter of metal striking concrete, and they spun as one, light sweeping the corridor they had just walked through, revealing nothing but the emptiness they had left behind. Though Lucy swore, she felt a rush of cold air brush past her cheek, as though something unseen had moved by, and Kyle barked a nervous laugh, suggesting it was just something falling from the ceiling. But even he didn't turn his back to the dark. They pressed deeper, Evan drawn toward another doorway at the far end where the floor sloped downward and the walls bore faint markings, strange overlapping letters carved into the plaster with what looked like a knife. And when his light hit them squarely, he saw the words, fragmented and desperate. "Leave now. Don't look back." And he felt his mouth go dry, his voice catching as he called Kyle and Lucy over. The three of them staring in silence, their breathing shallow, until Lucy suddenly grabbed his arm and pointed toward the center of the room they had just entered, where a toppled shelf had inexplicably shifted, as if nudged by an unseen hand, the sound of its legs scraping against the floor startling in the stillness, and Kyle whispered that maybe the place was unstable, maybe there were rats. But even he seemed unsure as he edged closer and crouched, brushing dust aside to reveal deep grooves in the floor, marks that looked recent, as though something heavy had been dragged toward the far wall. And when he followed the trail with his beam, it led to another door, this one barely hanging on its hinges, a chain lock twisted but not fastened, and beyond it only darkness. They hesitated, and in that hesitation came another noise, softer but more unnerving, a slow rhythmic creak, like the sound of a chair rocking back and forth, though there were no chairs in sight, and Lucy's eyes widened as she clutched Evan's sleeve, whispering for them to stop, to leave while they still could. But Evan couldn't shake the pull of curiosity, the gnawing need to know what lay beyond that door. So he stepped forward and pushed it open, the hinges screaming protest, revealing a narrow chamber lined with wooden crates and an ancient desk tipped on its side, paper spilling out and across the floor like pale leaves. And there, at the far corner, an old wooden rocking chair swayed gently as though someone had just stood from it, its motion slow and deliberate. And yet the room was empty, the dust on the floor undisturbed except for their own footprints. And Evan felt the hair on his arms rise as Kyle muttered that someone had to be in here with them, someone hiding, and Lucy shook her head, whispering that it didn't feel like a person. And for a long time they simply stood there, listening to the chair creak until it stilled on its own. Evan knelt to pick up one of the scattered papers, his flashlight balanced on his knee, and as he smoothed the page his breath caught. The handwriting matched that of the book upstairs, the same looping script, but the words here were jagged, frantic. They watched, they never left, and a chill ran through him, so strong he almost dropped the page, while Kyle peered over his shoulder and swore under his breath, Lucy backing toward the door as though something might spring from the shadows at any moment. And then, as if on cue, a sudden crash sounded from the corridor, loud and violent, like an entire cabinet being hurled to the ground, and they ran back through the door, their lights swinging wildly, beams catching the hallway now littered with debris that hadn't been there minutes before, an old shelf on its side, contents spilled, the air thick with dust motes swirling like insects in the light, and yet no sign of anyone who could have moved it. Kyle swore again, louder this time, insisting someone was playing a prank or living down here, and Evan started forward, scanning each doorway, calling out, his voice shaking but firm, asking if anyone was there. But the only answer was the distant drip of water and the sound of their own ragged breathing, and Lucy grabbed his arm, her nails biting into his skin as she hissed that they had to go, that they had enough proof in the photo and the book, that whatever was here didn't want them here. And Evan hesitated, torn between reason and the strange compulsion to press on, when his light caught something in the far corner of the corridor, something small and familiar. The book he had tucked into his jacket now lying on the floor as if it had been ripped from him, pages fluttering in the draft, and as he moved toward it a shadow crossed the beam of his flashlight, swift and silent, vanishing into the darkness before he could register it, leaving only the sound of footsteps fading deeper into the unseen parts of the mill. And the three of them stood rooted to the spot, hearts hammering, unsure whether to follow or flee, the air around them thick with something unspoken. And Evan bent to retrieve the book with shaking hands, feeling the cold leather once more, knowing that whatever they had stumbled upon was not done with them yet. If this story gripped you, hit like, share your theory in the comments, and subscribe for more mysteries. What do you think moved that chair, and who, or what, might be hiding in those shadows? Evan held the book tight against his chest as the three of them stood in that dim corridor, the smell of rust and mildew sharp in the back of their throats, and the sound of distant dripping water echoed like a heartbeat through the old walls, and Kyle finally broke the silence with a strained whisper, asking what that shadow had been, whether someone was living down here or if they had just imagined it. But neither Evan nor Lucy answered, their minds too busy trying to process the fact that the book had somehow ended up yards away from where Evan had been standing, and as Lucy's flashlight beam trembled across the floor, she noticed a narrow track in the dust, not footprints, but something dragged, a sweeping line that trailed from the overturned shelf to the far end of the hall, where another doorway stood slightly ajar, its chipped white paint hanging in strips, and she pointed with a shaking hand, her voice thin as she suggested maybe they should look, maybe it would explain everything, and Kyle laughed nervously, the sound brittle, saying that was the last thing they should do, but still taking a cautious step forward, drawn by that same gnawing curiosity that had brought them into the mill in the first place, and Evan followed, his pulse quickening, every creak of the floorboards beneath his feet feeling too loud, while Lucy stayed a few steps behind, clutching her jacket closed like armor, whispering that this was crazy, that they needed to go back upstairs, but her voice carried no conviction because she was moving forward too. The door gave way with a reluctant groan and opened onto a room smaller than the others, maybe once a storage closet, its shelves now bare except for a few rusted cans and an old broom leaning against the wall, and for a moment it seemed ordinary. But then Evan's light swept across the ceiling and revealed a series of handprints smudged into the grime, dozens of them, some small, some large, all dark and blurred as though pressed there in haste, and Lucy gasped softly, stepping back while Kyle tilted his head, saying maybe kids had come down here years ago, though his voice shook as he said it, and Evan stepped closer, reaching up to brush his fingers near one of the prints, feeling the cold dampness there, noticing how some of them looked fresh, the outline crisp as though made only hours ago. Before he could say anything, a sudden sound cut through the air, a low, rhythmic tapping, faint at first and then growing louder, coming from somewhere beyond the far wall, and the three of them froze, their eyes darting toward each other, and Lucy's whisper was barely audible as she asked if either of them heard it, and Kyle nodded, his jaw tight, moving toward the wall and pressing his ear against the peeling paint, his face pale as he said he could hear it clearer now, like fingers drumming, slowly on wood, and Evan stepped up beside him, straining to hear, and sure enough there it was, tap tap tap, a deliberate cadence, and then silence, so sudden it made them all jump. They backed out of the room, the air feeling heavier now, as if the walls themselves were closing in, and started down another corridor, their lights catching more debris, more fragments of the life that had once existed here. A cracked hard hat, a child's plastic toy coated in dust, a stack of faded photographs stuck together by time, showing workers smiling in front of machines that no longer worked, and Lucy murmured that maybe those workers had never really left, that maybe some part of them still lingered here, and Kyle snapped at her to stop saying things like that, his nerves frayed. But even as he spoke, a new sound rose from somewhere deeper in the mill, not the tapping this time, but a low dragging scrape, like something heavy being pulled across the floor, and Evan's pulse quickened as he swung his light toward the sound, catching only the edge of the darkness beyond, and he called out, his voice quivering, asking if anyone was there, but the scrape continued for another few seconds and then ceased as suddenly as it had begun. They turned a corner and found themselves in a larger chamber, this one dominated by a massive rusted machine, its gears frozen in place, cables hanging like vines, and scattered around it were chairs arranged in a semicircle, each one facing the machine, some toppled, some upright, all coated in decades of dust, and Lucy whispered that it felt like a meeting or a class, like people had sat here and watched something, and Kyle shone his light over the chairs, pointing out that some of them still had indentations in the seat cushions, fresh-looking, as if someone had only just gotten up, and Evan swallowed hard, feeling that prickling at the back of his neck, the unshakable sense of being watched, though the room appeared empty except for them. As they edged around the machine, Evan's boot caught on something, and he nearly tripped, looking down to see a cluster of broken dishes on the floor, ceramic shards scattered as though a plate had been thrown or dropped in anger, and he crouched, brushing aside the debris, his hand closing on something metallic, a key, old and tarnished, with a tag still attached that read simply storage, and he turned it over in his hand, frowning, and Lucy asked where the storage room might be. But before anyone could answer, another sound shattered the silence. The sharp crack of wood splintering, followed by the unmistakable creak of a door swinging open somewhere behind them, though they had not touched any doors in minutes. And they spun as one, flashlights crisscrossing, catching only dust and shadow. Kyle swore under his breath, gripping a length of broken pipe he had picked up earlier, muttering that if someone was down here messing with them, they would regret it. And Evan said nothing, his mind racing, instead moving toward the source of the sound, following a narrow passage that sloped downward again, the air colder now, dampness dripping from the ceiling onto his shoulders, and at the end of the passage they found another door, this one marked with a faded stencil, storage, the tag on, the key in Evan's hand matching perfectly, and they exchanged uneasy glances before Evan slid the key into the lock, his fingers trembling, and turned it until it clicked with a loud metallic snap, the sound echoing down the passage like a gunshot, and he pushed the door open slowly, revealing a room cluttered with forgotten equipment, crates stacked haphazardly, and rows of shelving sagging under the weight of rusted tools and ledgers. And for a moment it seemed lifeless, just another relic of the past. But then a book slid from one of the shelves and hit the ground with a soft thud, though no one had touched the shelf, and Lucy let out a stifled cry, backing into Evan, who felt the cold sweat prickling down his back as he swung his light over the shelves, seeing nothing out of place except for the book, now lying open on the dusty floor, its pages fluttering slightly in a draft they could not feel, and on the visible page were words written in the same familiar script, "Still here. Still waiting." Evan's throat went dry, his grip tightening on the flashlight, and Kyle stepped forward to close the book, but froze as another object fell from a higher shelf, an old metal cup clanging against the concrete and rolling toward their feet, the sound unnervingly loud in the confined space, and Lucy gasped, whispering that they needed to leave right now, that this wasn't worth whatever they thought they'd find. But Evan, driven by something deeper than fear, scanned the room again. Evan hesitated at the top of the narrow stairway, feeling the uneven concrete edge beneath his boots and hearing the faint shuffle of something unseen far below. And Kyle muttered that this was insane, that whatever had moved down there wasn't their business. But his own feet betrayed his words as he stepped closer, gripping the length of pipe in his hand as though it could keep fear at bay. And Lucy squeezed Evan's arm tightly, whispering that maybe they should call someone, maybe even the police. But her voice was weak and uncertain, because deep down she knew they wouldn't leave now, not after everything they had already seen. And Evan slowly descended, his flashlight beam shaking as it swept over the crumbling stone walls, revealing old wiring that sagged like spiderwebs and faded stenciled numbers marking each step, the air growing colder and thicker with every downward motion until their breaths came out in pale mist. And when they reached the bottom, they found themselves in a corridor narrower than any before, the ceiling low enough that Kyle had to duck slightly, and the smell was stronger here, a mixture of rust and damp wood, and something faintly sweet that made Evan's stomach tighten. And Lucy pointed out that there were marks along the walls, long scratches as though something had been dragged, and she shivered as the sound of their footsteps echoed strangely, doubling back to them as if the darkness itself was breathing. They moved slowly, cautious with each step, until they reached a junction where the corridor split in two, one path blocked by a collapsed beam and the other vanishing into pitch black. And Evan said they should check the open path, while Kyle ran his hand along the rough wall, muttering that it felt wrong, like this place hadn't been touched in decades, and yet someone had been here recently. And as they continued they passed a row of small rooms, each with rusted metal doors hanging open. Inside only broken chairs and scattered papers, some of which still bore faint writing, diagrams that made no sense, circles and arrows drawn in red ink. And Lucy picked up one of the papers, brushing dust from its surface, reading aloud words that made her shiver. "Wait for them. Watch for them. They always come back." Her voice cracked, and she dropped a page as a sudden gust swept through the corridor, strong enough to rattle the door frames and send a spray of dust into the air. And they coughed and shielded their eyes as a loud metallic clatter echoed from somewhere ahead, as though a shelf had toppled over. Evan hurried forward, heart pounding, and found another chamber, larger than the others, its ceiling supported by thick wooden beams, and in the center stood a long table covered in layers of grime, and on the table sat a dozen jars filled with murky liquid, the faint outlines of something unidentifiable inside each, and Kyle swore softly, stepping back, while Lucy covered her mouth, eyes wide, whispering that they shouldn't touch anything, and Evan leaned closer, his light revealing a tarnished photograph beneath one of the jars, and he carefully pulled it free, brushing away dirt to reveal an image of people standing in this very room decades earlier, their faces blurred, but one of the figures bore an unsettling resemblance to someone they knew from town, and Evan blinked hard, unable to shake the feeling. But before he could speak, a sudden sound snapped his focus, a faint rhythmic creaking, like the sound of a chair slowly rocking, coming from the corner of the chamber. They turned their lights toward it and saw an old wooden chair indeed rocking gently back and forth, though no one sat in it. And Lucy whimpered, gripping Evan's sleeve, while Kyle advanced cautiously, reaching out to stop the chair, his hand freezing inches away as the motion stopped on its own, and a long, low groan echoed through the beams above them, dust raining down, and Evan whispered that maybe they needed to get out before the place collapsed. But just as they turned to leave, another sound carried through the chamber, a faint voice, distant yet clear, a woman's voice humming a melody, slow and mournful, and they all froze, their eyes darting to the dark corners of the room. But there was no one, only the jars, the rocking chair now still, and the eerie echo of that voice lingering in the air. Lucy's breathing quickened as she begged them to go, her voice trembling, and Kyle nodded rapidly, backing toward the corridor. But Evan stayed rooted, trying to understand, and his light caught a narrow crawl space in the far wall, partly obscured by a fallen beam, and something about it called to him, a whisper at the back of his mind urging him forward, but he shook it off and turned to follow the others. They retraced their steps, the corridor feeling longer now, the shadows deeper, until they reached the junction, and as they climbed the stairs they heard another crash behind them, louder this time, like shelves collapsing, and they broke into a run, scrambling up the steps two at a time, emerging back into the upper hall gasping for air, and Lucy leaned against the wall, tears in her eyes, asking what had just happened down there, and Kyle shook his head, muttering that he didn't want to know, that they should just leave and never come back. Evan looked around the upper chamber, feeling that something had changed, that the air itself was heavier, and as he swung his light over the walls, his beam landed on something new, another set of handprints, fresh in the dust, where none had been before, trailing toward the exit. They followed those prints out into the night air, their lungs grateful for the crisp breeze, and for a moment they stood in silence outside the old mill, the moon casting pale light over the decaying structure, and Kyle threw the pipe aside, muttering that he was done, that he was never coming back, while Lucy hugged herself tightly, staring back at the dark windows, her face pale and drawn. Evan tucked the photograph into his jacket, his mind spinning with questions, his pulse still racing as the echo of that humming lingered in his ears, and as they walked back toward the car parked on the dirt road, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching them from the treeline. Though when he turned his light toward the woods, he saw only swaying branches and drifting fog, and the three of them climbed into the car, without a word, the engine's roar breaking the oppressive silence. As they pulled away, leaving the abandoned mill behind, unaware that high in one of the windows a lone rocking chair had begun to move again. If this story gripped you, hit like, share your theory in the comments, and subscribe for more mysteries. What do you think was hidden in those lower chambers? Driving through the winding back roads with the dark silhouette of the mill shrinking in the distance, Evan kept glancing at the photograph folded in his jacket pocket as Lucy sat in the backseat silent, her arms wrapped around herself, while Kyle gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, his jaw clenched, and the car's headlights carved narrow tunnels through the mist rising off the wet asphalt, the rhythmic hum of the engine failing to soothe the unease building between them. And, after several minutes of silence, Lucy suddenly said she wanted to see the photo again, her voice trembling, and Evan hesitated before handing it back to her, watching in the rear view as she traced her fingers over the blurred faces, whispering that one of them looked like Mr. Hanley, the old man who used to run the hardware store and who vanished decades ago without explanation, and Kyle shook his head, saying it was just a coincidence, that they were letting their imagination run wild. But Evan reminded him of the handwriting on the papers, the jars, the fresh handprints, and the rocking chair, and the car fell quiet again as the weight of what they'd seen settled over them. They stopped at a 24-hour diner on the edge of town, its flickering neon sign casting a sickly glow across the parking lot, and the bell over the door jingled as they entered, the scent of old coffee and fried food filling the air, and they took a booth in the corner, ordering coffee they didn't really want, the waitress giving them a puzzled look as they huddled over the photograph and tried to make sense of everything, and Lucy whispered that they needed to tell someone, maybe the sheriff, but Kyle scoffed, saying nobody would believe them and that telling anyone would just make them look crazy. Yet Evan wasn't convinced, his mind still replaying the sound of the humming in the chamber, how real it had felt, how close it had sounded. He excused himself to the restroom and stood in front of the cracked mirror, gripping the sink and staring at his own reflection, wondering if he was losing his grip or if they had stumbled onto something far bigger than a decaying building. And as he splashed cold water on his face, he thought he heard a soft creak, like a door opening behind him. But when he spun around, the restroom was empty, the single stall door hanging open, the hum of the fluorescent light above the only sound, and he returned to the booth unsettled. Lucy was showing Kyle something on her phone, a local forum filled with old legend about the mill, stories about workers who vanished and voices heard after dark, and one entry from just a month ago describing a figure in a window captured in a photo by hikers, a figure that matched the shadow they'd seen, and Evan's stomach tightened as he read the post. The words, "It's watching," repeating like a refrain. They paid quickly and left, the night feeling heavier now, and drove Lucy home first, the old houses lining her street dark and silent, and she lingered at the door, thanking them but begging them not to go back, her eyes wide with genuine fear, and Kyle muttered something about getting some sleep, though Evan noticed he double-checked the locks on the car when they left her house. As they drove through the quiet town, the fog thickened, and Evan said he needed to return to the mill in daylight, that he couldn't let it rest, and Kyle cursed under his breath, saying he wouldn't risk it, that they were lucky nothing worse happened. But Evan countered that something wasn't right, that the photograph alone was proof of something, and Kyle finally said fine, but only if they went together, and only once more, just to satisfy Evan's obsession, and then never again. The next morning, they returned, the sun struggling through a blanket of low clouds, the air still damp and carrying the smell of wet leaves, and the mill looked different in daylight, less menacing but still broken and lifeless, its windows gaping like empty eyes, and they parked the car closer this time, stepping out cautiously as the gravel crunched beneath their boots. They explored the outer grounds first, circling the building, and Evan noticed fresh scuffs in the dirt near a side entrance, as though someone had dragged something heavy recently, and Kyle examined the mark silently, his brow furrowed, while Evan snapped a few photos with his phone, the sound of the shutter startling a crow that took flight from the roof, with a harsh caw. They moved inside again, the sunlight cutting through the broken windows in angled beams that revealed dust swirling in the air, and they retraced their steps to the upper chamber, finding the jar still there on the table, undisturbed. But the photograph Evan had taken was gone, and his breath caught as he searched the table, the floor, even beneath the jars. But it was simply missing, and Kyle looked around sharply, saying maybe someone else had been here, and that thought hung over them as they decided to check the staircase again. This time they descended slower, the daylight failing to reach far into the depths, and Evan's flashlight illuminated the same walls, the same junction, but as they passed the small rooms they noticed something new. One of the metal doors that had been open was now closed, and when Evan pushed it open it groaned loudly, revealing an otherwise empty room except for a single wooden chair placed in the center, facing the wall, and on the seat lay the photograph Evan had lost, the edges curling, slightly as though handled recently, and he stepped forward, reaching for it, his hand trembling, while Kyle muttered under his breath that this was too much. Evan picked it up and saw that someone had drawn on it in fresh ink, a rough sketch of an eye in the corner, and as he stared at it, trying to comprehend, the faint sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere deeper in the corridor, steady and slow, and they both froze, their ears straining, but the footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving only silence, and Evan felt a chill race down his spine. They backed out of the room and moved toward the stairs, both on edge, and as they began to climb, The same humming they had heard before drifted up through the passage, clearer now in the daylight, and Kyle spun around, his eyes wide, whispering for them to hurry, and they emerged into the upper floor once more, stepping into the sunlight as though breaking free from something unseen, both breathing heavily, and Evan tucked the altered photograph into his pocket, staring back at the mills. Dark interior, knowing they hadn't imagined what they'd experienced, and that whatever was in there wasn't finished with them yet. If this story gripped you, hit like, share your theory in the comments, and subscribe for more mysteries. What do you think that I drawn on the photograph means? ChatGPT. The next several days passed in a strange haze as Evan, Kyle, and Lucy tried to return to normal life. But the photograph with the drawn eye burned in Evan's mind, and the unease lingered like a shadow that would not lift. And even though he tucked the picture into a drawer in his apartment, he found himself pulling it out late at night to stare at it under the soft yellow glow of his desk lamp, tracing the ink lines with his thumb and wondering who had drawn it and why, while outside his window. The small town moved on unaware of what they had stumbled upon, yet every creak in his old building made him startle, every faint sound in the hallway making him hold his breath, and he began to feel as though someone was watching him when he walked home after work, headlights seeming to follow a little too long in the distance before turning off suddenly. One evening Kyle called him, his voice tight, saying he had driven past the mill on his way home from a job and swore he saw movement in an upper window, a shape shifting behind the glass, and Evan felt his pulse quicken as Kyle confessed he kept driving because something in him screamed not to stop, not to look closer, and that night Evan hardly slept, tossing in bed as the memory of the footsteps and the humming replayed over and over, until the gray light of dawn broke through the curtains. And he sat up with a sudden decision that he needed to go back one last time, to find some rational explanation or proof that would let him finally move on. He called Lucy first, who answered groggily and immediately told him not to go, her voice sharp with fear, reminding him of the rocking chair, the falling book, the photograph appearing where it shouldn't, and when Evan said he needed closure, she only said if he insisted then she would meet him there because she couldn't let him go alone, her loyalty outweighing her terror. And after that call he reached Kyle, who at first refused outright, but then cursed under his breath, and said fine they would meet in the parking lot near the diner at noon. The drive out felt surreal, the bright sunlight doing little to soothe the gnawing tension in Evan's chest, and when they met up, the three of them stood by Kyle's truck in an uneasy silence until Lucy finally said they had to be quick, get in and out, no wandering off. And Kyle grumbled agreement as he grabbed a crowbar from the back of the truck, more for reassurance than for any practical purpose. They approached the mill again, the gravel crunching underfoot, and as they stepped inside, the air felt cooler than it should have been, carrying the faint scent of rust and damp wood, and the sun streaming through the broken windows made long slants of light that cut across the dusty floor where their footprints from days ago were still faintly visible. They moved as a group, staying close, their eyes darting to every shadow, and when they reached the upper chamber Evan froze. The jars on the table were gone, leaving only clean circles in the dust where they had once stood, and the rocking chair had been moved to the corner, turned to face the wall, and Lucy whispered that someone had been here, someone who wanted them to know, while Kyle swore under his breath and scanned the room with quick jerks of his head as though expecting someone to step out from behind a pillar. They decided to head straight for the staircase, determined to see if anything below had changed, and as they descended the steps each creak of the wood felt magnified. Each breath sounded too loud, and at the bottom they moved carefully past the empty rooms, Evan leading with a flashlight whose beam quivered slightly with the tremor in his hand, and they found the room with the chair still there, but now the chair was toppled over, lying on its side as though knocked down violently, and the photograph Evan had reclaimed was pinned to the wall with a rusted nail, the drawn eye now smeared, as if a hand had dragged across it. Evan reached out slowly, pulling it free, and as he did, a sudden noise erupted from deeper in the corridor, a metallic clatter like something heavy falling, and they all jumped, Lucy stifling a yelp as Kyle gripped the crowbar tighter, and Evan motioned for them to follow as he crept toward the source, the air growing colder, the silence pressing down like a weight. They turned a corner and saw an old metal shelving unit on its side, its contents scattered, and among the debris lay another photograph, this one older, yellowed with age, showing three men in work overalls standing in front of what looked like the same mill decades earlier. But in the upper corner of the frame was a shadowy figure in the window, indistinct but human-shaped, and Lucy's hand flew to her mouth as she whispered that it matched the shape in their own photograph, and Evan's mind reeled with the implications, his rational thoughts crumbling under the mounting evidence that something was not right about this place. Suddenly a faint sound drifted through the corridor, a low rhythmic creaking, and they followed it cautiously until they reached another chamber where an old swing hung from the ceiling, gently swaying though no wind or movement could explain it. And the sight made Lucy back away, muttering that they needed to leave, that they had enough, and Evan agreed though every part of him still burned with questions. But as they turned to go, Kyle shone his flashlight toward the end of the corridor and froze. The beam illuminated a series of fresh footprints in the dust, barefoot and leading into the darkness, and they stared at them in stunned silence, the prints too large and too recent to dismiss, and for a moment none of them moved, the humming sound starting again softly, as if carried on some unseen current, and Lucy grabbed Evan's arm, her nails digging in as she whispered that they had to leave now, and Kyle nodded quickly, backing away slowly, his eyes never leaving the footprints, and together they hurried back up the stairs, their footsteps echoing like gunshots in the quiet, until they burst out into the light of the upper floor, the sun now sinking toward the horizon, bathing the mill in orange glow. They didn't stop until they were outside, gulping the fresh air like survivors of some unseen storm, and without another word they climbed into the truck and drove off, the mill shrinking in the distance behind them as the road stretched out ahead, none of them speaking for a long time, the photograph with the smeared eye resting on Evan's lap as he stared out the window, feeling both relief and a hollow ache of unanswered questions. And as the first stars pricked the darkening sky, he whispered more to himself than to the others that maybe some places are meant to keep their secrets, and Lucy, leaning against the window in the back seat, closed her eyes and nodded silently, while Kyle tightened his grip on the wheel and focused on the road, each of them knowing deep down they would never return. If this story gripped you, hit like, share your theory in the comments, and subscribe for more mysteries. What do you think those footprints belong to? And why did the humming never stop?